Yo, 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 what's happening? Um, what do I got going on here? Not a whole lot, just had a little bit of time. I know it's been a little while since I've stream dream. I've just been working every day, like usual, taking my boy to school, picking him up. He's over at his friend's house right now. I'm going to go get him here in a little bit. I've been reading books. I finished reading Isaiah of the New English Standard Version. Excuse me. And I moved on to Jeremiah. Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah was a prophet. Or was he a bullfrog? I don't know. I think that's where the song probably started. Jeremiah was a prophet. And then eventually someone came along and said, Jeremiah was a bullfrog. That sounded pretty good. It was like, well, it sounds like rock and roll, man. And then they did it, and it went down in history. So I've been reading Jeremiah, and it's pretty cool. I've been getting a little bit more into my Bible studies. So that's something a little bit out of the ordinary for me. What else have I been reading? See if I got a couple books laying around here. Tragedy and Hope 101. Talking about, at this point where I'm at in the book, I'm about not even 60 pages into it yet, where it's talking about Woodrow Wilson and how he was basically put into office by a guy named, can't remember the guy's name, Edward Mandell House. Okay. So where I'm at in this book, about 60 pages into it, it's talking about Woodrow Wilson and how Edward Mandell House, who wrote Philip Drew Administrator, actually had a lot of influence, and he was a member of the network. And actually, it was on his recommendation that Woodrow Wilson got major support in the primaries and ended up becoming president. So basically he was placed by this Edward Mandell House guy. Children's book, this biography of Mussolini. I started reading this. It's funny, he kind of looks like a punk rocker, doesn't he? He's like a hardcore punk dude getting ready to go into the mosh pit there. I actually know a guy who kind of looks like him. That's why I said that. Oh, here's another one I got from the library. Here's another big old heifer. The History of Israel, The Rise of Zionism to Our Time. And I'm just at the very beginning of this. This is a slow read. This is going to take me forever to read this. It's by Howard M. Sachar. I don't know how to say it. I don't want to get into this. It's too complex. I don't really know enough about it yet. I'm going to really have to study that book a little bit more. Let's see, where else? Here's another one I've been reading. Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov. It's pretty interesting. It's about these three brothers. It's about actually, I don't know if it's about the brothers. I mean, it's named after the brothers. But at this point in the story, it's kind of about the dad. He's just a real loser. And he abandoned his kids and basically sent them all away to be raised by other people while he partied and banged a lot of whores at his house. He was a landholder, and he had, in Russia, like any landowner, had hundreds of serfs. And so he had a lot of serfs, and he would bang all the serf girls and just had these huge orgies at his house all the time and kind of forgot about his kids and let them be raised by other people. And they just kind of went from place to place because they would go with like grandma, and then grandma would die, and then they'd go with like the uncle, and then the uncle would have to move away for military service, and then they'd go somewhere else. So it was these three brothers that were separated, and they all had very disparate sort of dispositions. And so they all kind of were brought back to the father's house at one point. And there was the oldest brother who sort of was at this point sort of demanding money from his dad, and had sort of this kind of lawsuit going with his dad to settle up, for his inheritance, because there was money for him to be inherited, but it just turned out the dad didn't want to give any money to the kids. He had money, but he was making excuses, and basically was telling the kid, he's like, no, you owe me money, but he should have paid the kid out. And then the second kid was a little bit more intellectual and went to university. And then the third son wanted to go into the monastery and become a monk. And so they had to, at the local monastery, they had like an elder who was there, who was like this very revered, sort of prestigious, sort of church elder. And I think that they might have been Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. And so the father and the brothers, sort of just as a matter of ceremony, met with this elder, this church elder, and the dad just made a total ass out of himself. He was just a total buffoon. It was really, really funny, actually, reading it. And then there was his wife's cousin was present, and his wife's cousin kept apologizing for him, and actually kind of like everybody else just kind of stood there with their mouths shut. But for some reason, his first wife's cousin, who was present, kept apologizing for him and kept kind of stepping in and sort of saying the quiet part out loud. And it's just really funny. There's a very keen sort of psychological situation going on between all these different people, and it's just kind of funny to see their interaction. Dostoevsky was definitely one of the first depth psychologists of I don't want to say our time, because this is like the mid 1800s or the late 1800s. But he was pretty good. I mean, I think even Sigmund Freud took a lot of cues from him, and so did Carl Jung as well. I think Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud both were big fans of Dostoevsky and learned a lot of what they knew from him. So yeah, he knew a lot about psychology, and which is interesting to me because I'm a psychology major. In college I got my degree in psychology, and I actually got 2 degrees. I got one in psychology, and I also got one in language studies, like language acquisition, because in college I studied Spanish, and I studied Russian, and I studied Italian. And before that I had lived in Germany, I had lived in Italy, and then starting in 1999 I started teaching myself Dutch. And I basically learned it just from reading books and watching movies, and I just taught it to myself, which is a really difficult thing to do. Usually you want to have a teacher. You want to be in a class and do workbook assignments and be forced to interact in ways you would normally interact. When I took Russian and when I took Spanish, just those 2 languages, there were a lot of native speakers in the class, and so I was forced to always pair up with people who knew the language really well. Italian, nobody knew it. I think there was one guy in the class from Sicily. So that's another thing I've been studying as I've been getting back to my Russian. And I have a Russian, like an original, I don't want to say an original copy because it's not like a first edition, but it is a Russian language version of Dostoevsky's The Gambler. It's called Igrok. And so I've been going through that and translating it, which is really tedious. You can find a few useful things in there. It's not a great way to learn a language. I had done that with Dutch. I had translated a couple of Stephen King books, which is a little easier because there's more colloquial usage in there. But when you're reading from Dostoevsky, you're reading like like a 19th century version of Russian, which is, works in a grammatical sense. You're still using the mother tongue, but at the same time, you're not using modern colloquial Russian, which, like, if you were to learn it in a class today, like when I took Russian, they teach you all the common Russian that's used. Like, for instance, let's see, the use of the word militia in Russian was used during Soviet times to speak of the police. They were militia was the police, but they don't call them that anymore. Okay, so it's kind of an outdated term, and there's a lot of outdated terms, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union and all that. There's a lot of the language has changed, and not everybody in the whole Russian Empire is speaking the Muscovite dialect. They're speaking more regional now, where as before everything was broadcast from Moscow, so there was very little dialectical difference according to where you were living. Everybody spoke with a Moscow accent and a Moscow dialect because that's where the institution was, and it spread very far and wide from Moscow. Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. Been reading that. I got to the part, well, let's see, I'm only 60 pages into this one, and I got to the point where, what's his name? That's the problem when you read so many books. You forget the names of everybody. There's Karelin and then Stormgren. Stormgren, I think, is the main guy, right? So Stormgren was finally relieved of his duty as the liaison between Karelin and the rest of the human race. And so he got old, and then he was revisited by an agent, and as he was living on his little lake property out in the middle of nowhere, at 70 years old, 60 years old. And so we'll see where that leads. I mean, that book is about, Childhood's End is about an alien invasion. You ever see the movie, or the TV show V back in the 80s? It's basically the same thing. At this point in the program, it's very important for you to notice that not only did I cut my hair finally, but my beard has grown out considerably. So tomorrow I am going to be going down to Greg's rehearsal room and recording vocal tracks on one of the songs that he and I recorded last session we did at the Pus Cavern. I'm going to be doing vocal tracks on a song called Lord of the Lake. It is a newer Deep Tank song, and nobody's heard it yet, and I'm pretty excited about it because it's one of the better takes that we got on that session. And I had done the guitar tracks last year, and I did a bass track I think towards the end of last year, and I think I might actually put some keyboards on this one, but I'm going to do the vocal track first. And so I'm going to go in tomorrow and do the vocal tracks. And I told my son that he's going to be accompanying me on this trip, and I told him to be prepared because he's going to have to sit and either play video games or mess around on his phone while I scream into the microphone. And he asked me if I could call his grandma and have her come and pick him up before that happens. So apparently he's not as excited about that kind of activity as he used to be when he was smaller. So I've been a little bit on this Dostoevsky kick, and so not only did I begin reading The Possessed for the second time, but I am concurrently reading two other of his major novels written towards the end of his life. Crime and Punishment, which I'm sure you've heard of. Everybody's heard of Crime and Punishment. and the other one is the Brothers Karamazov. And that one is a little bit, I don't know if I'm equipped to even judge the books yet, since I'm not very far into them. But the Brothers Karamazov has what do you call it, a reputation for being a very deep and spiritual book, embracing some of the virtues and values of the Orthodox Christian Church, the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, and a very deeply religious book. Now, Crime and Punishment might also be considered a religious book, and what I know of that book is it's sort of about a man who kills a woman and is sort of forced to live with the consequences of that, which can be very torturous for the individual. And I haven't gotten that far in the book yet. Actually, where I am in the book is really in the first couple of chapters, where this young man has sort of awoken on a day, and in his attempt to sort of slip by the landlady whom he owes money to, he makes his way downstairs 5 flights down to the street, and he's walking through the streets of St. Petersburg, and he's wearing really old, dirty clothes. The guy is pretty poor. And so far, this book in particular, and really all of Dostoevsky's material, has caused me to feel not really so bad about my financial situation, which is not great. But any destitution that I may be suffering at this particular moment in time is negligible in relation to most of the characters in Dostoevsky's book, who live in the most abhorrent, squalid conditions of Russia in these just really out of the way kind of village type settings. These basically peasants living out there wearing really old clothes. These are the kind of people that they don't buy new socks when they get holes in them. They don't throw anything away. They just kind of take old clothes and cut them into smaller pieces and stitch them together for later use. And so they're walking around with these kind of bundles of rags on everywhere, and it's freezing cold outside, and babies are dying, and everybody's sick. And they're basically eating probably a variety of foods that we might find rather tasty if we were to try them. Even though we have these refined palates here in the West from prolonged exposure to McDonald's, Burger King, Jack in the Box, and, you know, for the rich people, you know, Red Robin, the Olive Garden. So I've noticed in my own life that cooking food has become a really rewarding experience, considering all the work experience I have working in restaurants. I've learned how to cook quite efficiently, and although most of my stuff is fried and I'm not much of a baker, I do throw together some things that are mighty tasty. And so I am relating these kinds of things to the events in Dostoevsky's books, where he presents the mundane and destitute lives of certain Russian peasants. I can hear my son in the other room giggling away. He's watching meme videos on YouTube, and he has gotten to the point to where the majority of his life is a constant stream of reenactments of certain memes that he has viewed on YouTube, which most people he encounters probably can't relate to in any way. But I consider it a phase that resembles many of the phases that I went through at his age. As I recall, being 10 years old, probably a little bit more so when I was 7 or 8, I would act out these scenes from movies for my parents' friends, and they would look at me in sort of a questioning way, and they'd shake their heads and say, "Wow, son, you've got a hell of an imagination." And I still go through that to some extent, and my son goes through it, and so I just kind of look proudly on him and say, "Son, I was exactly like you." And so whenever he shows me something weird that I absolutely can't relate to, I just figure it's just like me. And look at him go. He actually just had his final day of 4th grade yesterday, and so today's his first day of summer vacation, and he is refusing to change out of his bedclothes. He wants to stay in his bedclothes the rest of the day. And so, it's the small things in life that you have to appreciate. Back to Crime and Punishment. So this young man, I'm going to find out his name. I actually have a copy. This is the current library copy that I have checked out. And, okay, Raskolnikov is the guy's name. What's his first name? Okay, yeah, we just call him Raskolnikov. Actually, let me go back to The Possessed for a second. So this book, The Possessed, this is my copy of The Possessed, which I have read all the way through now. And the print of this book, I don't know if you can see this. Look at this print of this book. Okay, here's the print of the book. The print is so tiny in this book. This book is the reason I started wearing glasses when I read. I never read glasses when I read until I got this book. And the text, the type, is so small that I actually had to buy a pair of magnifying glasses in order to read it. And actually, if you look at the girth of the book, it's really a pretty slim novel, like in this particular format. But if it was like a hardcover, it would probably be more like this, like if the print was normal size. So I thought this wasn't going to take me very long to read, and it really took me a long time. It took me a couple months to read it. Actually, it took me the better part of a year when I consider the other books I was reading at the same time. But I would say that, like, all told, it would be a couple months worth of reading. It's a pretty dense book with a lot of interesting detail. So anyway, back to Crime and Punishment. This character, Raskolnikov, he goes downstairs, slips past his landlady. He's walking down the street in his dirty old rags of clothes, and people are driving by making fun of his hat, and he decides that he doesn't think he should be wearing this hat because it's drawing too much attention to him, and he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. He thought that by dressing shabbily that he would be avoiding attention, but this ridiculous top hat that he's wearing is causing people to hang out of their carriages and yell things at him as they pass by. So he goes to this lady's house, which I believe is the woman who he winds up murdering. And she is sort of we call it a pawnbroker. What do you call someone who works in a pawn shop? Somebody who loans out money for trinkets and objects. It's probably a profession that many people in Russia at that time were doing. And so she would loan him small amounts of money for things like his father's watch and some other stuff. And he ended up, he had owed her money from a while back, and I guess he hadn't paid off some of the loans, and so when he went to go sort of pawn his father's watch, she only gave him a few bucks for it. And so what he did was he took that sort of pittance of an amount of money and took it down to the local bar. He just really wanted to sit down and have a drink, and he goes in there, and this bar setting eerily reminded me of the book 1984, when Winston goes into the neighborhood occupied by the proles, and he goes into a bar and tries to sort of fit in a little bit. And I think he's wearing his party clothes, perhaps, and people are looking at him strange. And he goes into this sort of local bar and he talks to some people. And this scene in Crime and Punishment really reminded me of that scene in 1984. And so I wonder whether George Orwell had this scene in mind when he wrote it. I sometimes wonder that when I read something that harkens back to another literary work. And so he's sitting in this bar, and it's just a really gross and stinky bar where it just smells like spilt beer and cabbage and all kinds of other Russian stuff, fish that's been sitting out, because I guess they cook food there as well. It's a public house, basically, and so they probably make food every now and then and sell it. In Russia, they probably sell whatever they can. They just have babushka, make some, borscht or something, and they sell it where they can, sort of lemonade stand kind of style thing. And so he's sitting there, and this kind of curious looking man comes in, and apparently the bar owner is actually all know this guy because he's been showing up talking to people and talking to them lately. And this guy sort of sees Raskolnikov sitting there and decides to come over to him and strike up a conversation. And he sort of comes up to him with this sort of pretentious air of, first Raskolnikov looks at the guy and thinks he looks like some sort of a retired clerk or some kind of bureaucrat. And the guy kind of looks at him and sort of looks condescendingly, says, well, you seem like, kind of a smart guy, even though you don't really look that impressive. And the man sits down and proceeds him to tell this horrible story of how he took his family's money and just completely squandered it. And just, he at one point had gotten a job. He was really poor to begin with. His family was living in they renting this horrible portion of a room, and he had all these kids, and his wife was doing what she could to make ends meet. His 14-year-old daughter became a prostitute and had to carry what's called a yellow card, which is, you probably heard of the band, maybe, yellow card. The yellow card is something in Russia that basically, when you get busted for prostitution, the police, they confiscate your passport, because in Russia in those days you needed a passport to sort of travel around. It's like how we have to carry an ID here. Well, you can't travel in any way without a passport in 19th century Russia. And so if a girl gets busted for being a prostitute, they confiscate her passport and replace it with this yellow card. And so they forced his daughter to carry a yellow card because she was the one who was supporting the family now through her prostitution. And so this guy took the rest of her money and spent it at the bar getting drunk. And he's telling Raskolnikov this story, and Raskolnikov's kind of considering his own sort of plight and how he's unable to really pay his bills. And he's a young, able-bodied man and educated at that, and so he should be able to sort of pay his bills, but he's just really struggling. But this guy who comes in and starts talking to him is utterly hopeless. This guy in his 50s who's just basically, his family is at the mercy of his drinking binge. And the guy sold out, he got a job for a little while, and once he got the job, his wife started actually really treating him well and cooking for him and all this stuff. And he ended up selling off the clothes that he was wearing at his new job, and so the guy's basically at this point completely hopeless. And after he finishes telling Raskolnikov the story about how he just squandered the remaining pocket change that his family had to their name, Raskolnikov just like can't believe this story, and he gives him what little change he has. I mean, he has nothing, and he feels so bad for the guy. He just gives him the rest of his money. In fact, I think what happens is he ends up going back to the guy's apartment, and he witnesses and sees the guy's family, and they're like beating the daughter, and just like they're beating the kids because the kids are crying because they're hungry, and the mom's just beating them to get them to shut up. And so he feels so bad for the family, he just takes what little he has left of the money that he had just pawned his father's watch, and he had a couple drinks at the bar, and just whatever change he had left, he just kind of left it on the counter for this family. He felt so bad for them. One detail I left out: after he got done pawning his father's watch, he seemed to be thinking in his mind about killing this woman, the pawnbroker, I guess that's what you call it. I have to figure out if I'm using the right term for that. The woman who is loaning him the money, his creditor, he is considering killing this woman, and I don't know why, because he's depending on her financially, but for some reason he seems to have this murder fantasy, and I believe he went to her apartment actually to do the deed and kind of chickened out once he got there. Like as soon as she turned her back, he probably thought about how he was gonna like beat her brains out, but just decided in the moment not to do it. I imagine if you put yourself in the shoes of such a person, that they might have many false starts if they're not completely dedicated to the project at hand. So he went to her place, and after he left, I think that he was kind of... It doesn't really explain it. It just kind of hints at it. The narrative sort of hints at the fact that this guy's thinking about killing this woman. And what's interesting about Dostoevsky's book is they're not really written in the third person. They're sort of written in the first person, but from a sort of detached, sort of local bystander. Somebody who just kind of lives in the town, but is kind of a nobody. That's how The Possessed is. It's written from the point of view of somebody who plays a very minor role in the story, and who just sort of pieces together all these facts and compiles a story out of it. It kind of reminds me, in a way, of what Solzhenitsyn did later after his experiences in the Gulag Archipelago. He pieces together this very large story from all these... It's sort of a memoir, a collective memoir between he and basically anybody who he later comes into contact with who has experiences in this Gulag life. Other people who experienced the archipelago in their own ways, and his correspondences with these people and their accounts. You can't really say that the Gulag Archipelago is necessarily a history per se, quote unquote, scare quotes, history. It is more of a memoir. And so I don't want to say it's a work of fiction. Some people, especially people on the left, have said, oh, it's just made up. It's none of that stuff's real. They don't want to believe that socialism can lead to such horror, but in fact it did happen, and it's well documented. But this book in particular, talking about the Gulag Archipelago now, not Crime and Punishment, the Gulag Archipelago is this sort of collective memoir that is compiled by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Crime and Punishment has this sort of undertone that this guy wants to kill this lady, and I believe that he does. I've read a little bit about the story, I've heard a little bit about it, and that this guy ends up killing this woman, and that I guess the remainder of the story is him sort of dealing with the fallout of this murder that he's committed, and sort of the psychological turmoil that goes along with it. Now, what I find is interesting is in Tristan Haggard's expose on the The Possessed, or Demons, by Dostoevsky. He talks about a censored chapter, like a chapter that was left out of the book, and he's describing it. It's called At Tikhon's is the name of the chapter, where the character Nikolai Stavrogin, Nikolai Vasilyevich Stavrogin, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, that's my best Russian transliteration, that he goes to this bishop, this sort of, I don't want to say a retired bishop. The guy actually lives in like a monastery, and so he's got this kind of cell, but he's sort of a bishop of ill repute, and even within this monastery, there's certain authorities that don't really like him very much. But he's the guy. He has a very keen sense of perception, and when Nikolai goes in to speak to him, he seems to know exactly why he's there, even though he hasn't seen him since he was a little boy. And so what happens is Stavrogin actually gives this confession, mainly about this young girl named Matryoshka, that he had sort of defiled, a young girl, a very young girl, like 11 years old, and that he gives this horrid account of him taking advantage of this young girl, and which drove her to suicide. And in the part where it describes the lodging where this all took place, because he was renting, like a half a room. This happens a lot in this period of Russia, that you will rent a portion of a bedroom. Like they've got partitions, and you will rent a little space that has like basically a cot, and maybe an end table. And so he was renting this space that he was basically taking one of his many girlfriends back to. And this guy is a true rascal, like just a complete beast, just a nihilistic scoundrel to the nth degree. I'll go into The Possessed a little bit more as we go along. But the scene, the apartment on the 5th floor, kind of like in Crime and Punishment, he's describing an apartment very much like the apartment that he what's his name, Raskolnikov is renting. And as you're reading this sort of this censored chapter at Tikhon's in The Possessed, it's describing this apartment very much like the apartment that Raskolnikov is renting in Crime and Punishment. And so this little girl's living there, and Nikolai Vasilyevich Stavrogin. Nikolai Vasilyevich Stavrogin. Nikolai Vasilyevich Stavrogin actually, he takes advantage of this young girl. And, he's a very tall, very, handsome, very charming man. And he actually attracts a lot of women because he's just very evil. That's what I love about Dostoevsky. He's so honest in his portrayal of people, that this man who is basically an embodiment of nihilism attracts all the women, because he's basically like Satan in human form. And so this really disturbing chapter that Tristan Haggard was talking about in his expose. I actually had to go back and read it because I hadn't known about it. And I think that my main point of bringing this up is the fact that some of the scenes, some of the scenes in his books seem to repeat. That there's a geography that is that is consistent throughout his books. If you read White Nights by Dostoevsky, which I read like 20 years ago, some of the scenes even from that story are, that all takes place in St. Petersburg, in the 19th century. So there's a lot of overlap with the geography of these stories. But anyway, I don't want to get too much into this. I don't want to get too convoluted, but it's going to get worse, believe me. So the Brothers Karamazov is a story that seems, from Dostoevsky's point of view, to be autobiographical to some degree. The book is about these three sons that their father was sort of this buffoon, this rich buffoon who basically runs a harem out of his house, and he takes advantage of all his serfs. In Russia during these times, any landowner usually owned hundreds of slaves, basically, which they call them serfs, but they're basically slaves. They live on the property and they tend to the property, and any average landowner can afford hundreds of these serfs, and of course they have to feed them all. But I guess when you're wealthy and living in Russia in those days, I guess all you have to do is feed them some cabbage and potatoes, and they're good for the winter. But anyway, so this guy basically has orgies with all his serfs, and he's just a disgusting specimen of humanity, and he represents Dostoevsky's father. In fact, the man's name is Fyodor, which is Dostoevsky's first name, Fyodor Dostoevsky. So this man, Fyodor Karamazov, who's the character in the story, who basically represents Dostoevsky's dad, all three of his sons all kind of come home at a certain point all at once, and so that's where the story begins. There's sort of a backdrop of like how each son is sort of born from a different mom, and they're all raised by people other than the father because he's a total deadbeat dad and doesn't take care of any of his kids. And so the dad sort of neglects his children, and as he's having these wild sex orgies with all of his female serfs, the male serfs are actually taking care of his kids, and then maybe like grandma will come by and take the kid off his hands, and she'll raise him in another town, and then she dies, and then somebody else sort of takes care of these kids, and it sort of follows this progression of these kids kind of moving to different foster homes, and each one of his sons has a completely different personality type, and I'll go into the details of that later. I can't even remember their names at this point. I remember there's one named Ivan, there's one named Alosha or Alexei. In Russian you've got your diminutive names, so Alexei is a diminution of Alosha, and then what's his oldest sons? I think Ivan is the middle son. Dmitri is the oldest one. So it's Dmitri, Ivan, and Alosha, and the youngest son decides to come back to his father's home, and he wants to become part of the clergy. He goes to a monastery and decides to pay service to a local elder. It's in the monastery, and these aren't Catholic monasteries; these are Eastern Orthodox monasteries. And this local elder is very highly esteemed man, and a lot of the local peasants come to him and ask for a blessing, or they ask for some kind of advice or counsel, and he sort of waves his hand and gives them a blessing and tells them not to worry and just always trust in God and all this stuff. And so the family decides to meet with the elder because the youngest son, Alexei, is going to become, he's going into the service of the monastery. So he's basically going to be a monk who's shut away for many, many years. And so they kind of go there to sort of pay their respects and see their son off. And the oldest son actually doesn't even show up. And then there's another guy who's like the kind of wealthy cousin of the man's first wife who died, who was Dimitri's mother. So this guy's like a cousin of Dimitri's mother, shows up, and for some reason, as this dad is making a complete ass out of himself in front of this church elder, this man, I think his name is, here's Brothers Karamazov. This guy, I think his name is Musov. I can't even read this right now. Father Zosima is the name of the elder, the church elder. And what is Musov? Yeah, Peter Musov is, or Pyotr Musov is the name of the first son's cousin who comes out there and for some reason feels the need to sort of he feels the how can I say this? He feels the need to apologize for the behavior of the kid's dad who's there, because this guy makes the most utter buffoon out of himself. And it's funny because it kind of for some reason it kind of reminds me of somebody I know. I don't want to say anybody's name. I'm not trying to dox anybody right now, but this guy makes such an ass out of himself. It's just so hilarious. I was saying I like to read on the toilet. Well, I'm just sitting there on the crapper laughing my ass off reading this story with this guy making just such an ass out of himself and this other guy getting so tits. Everybody else just kind of looking down at the floor while dad's making an ass out of himself. But this one guy, for some reason, just feels the need to chime in and apologize for this guy. And it's just such a true expression of human nature and human psychology. I love Dostoevsky for this, so that's the reason I really want to exposit these books a little bit and just get into some of them, because as a psychology major myself, one of my degrees that I got in college is psychology. And I'll tell you what, I think anybody who wants to ever become a therapist or any kind of counselor or anybody who uses psychology in any manner of their life should read probably all of Dostoevsky's books. But I'm going to get into some more of these later and get into detail as I go along. Like I said, I didn't know what I was going to do with this podcast, but it seems like at this point it's kind of going in a literary direction, and some of it is a little bit of a like a vlog or a diary, but there's really not a lot to say about the music lately, other than the fact I'm about to do some vocal tracks tomorrow over at Greg's rehearsal studio. I'm going to scream my ass off into the microphone on a song called Lord of the Lake, which is sort of a swamp creature of a song, I call it. The song itself is very dark green, and I want to really embellish this dark green song and maybe later put some synthesizer tracks on it, and it'll be the next Deep Tank release. I'm just going to try to take everything song by song and do it one song at a time, and this is the next one that we're going to develop and produce, and it's called Lord of the Lake.